On October 3rd, 1979, in the middle of the night at 4 a.m., General William Odom, Lieutenant General William Odom, who was the military aide to President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was awakened by the National Military Command Center that informed him that he was now part of a missile threat assessment conference call because one of 3 radars on the West Coast had detected an inbound Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile that was projected to impact about 150 miles off the Oregon coast in just a few minutes. And he wrote in a memo later that day to National Security Advisor Brzezinski, quote, it is a very chilling experience to pick up the phone and hear NORAD repeating, we have high confidence in the system, and wonder how to use the remaining 4 or 5 minutes. That turned out to be a false alarm. It was a piece of Soviet space debris that had re-entered the atmosphere and was mistakenly categorized as an incoming ballistic missile. But then, just over a month later, on November 9th, 1979, an even more alarming incident happened. And in that case, it directly involved NORAD. So at just before 9 in the morning, data from a full-scale Soviet nuclear decapitation simulation, very similar to what we just saw, running at NORAD, was inexplicably sent to live warning displays there at Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska, the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, and the alternate National Military Command Center on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, triggering a false alert and a 6-minute threat assessment conference. Nobody ever quite figured out why this happened. For whatever reason, the simulation, which was designed to test NORAD's ability to respond to an actual attack, went out over the live displays. And when they tried to replicate the exact path that this data had taken, they were unable to replicate it. During this false alarm, NORAD activated all air defense interceptors and at least 10 planes took off, as did the president's doomsday plane, what was then called the National Emergency Airborne Command Post. Some air traffic controllers were ordered to immediately ground all commercial aircraft. The president and the Secretary of Defense were never notified. This latter point greatly concerned Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, who cabled President Carter shortly after the incident, saying, quote, it turns out the world can find itself on the brink of a precipice without the knowledge of the president or other U.S. leaders. 4 days later, Soviet General Secretary Brezhnev directed his U.S. ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, to deliver a private oral message to Carter expressing, quote-unquote, extreme anxiety about the incident, which had been widely reported and may also have been detected by Soviet intelligence. And finally, on November 20th, the then Secretary of Defense Harold Brown sent a detailed top-secret memorandum to President Carter about the false alarm, describing the causes as well as his assessment of the lessons learned. And then, again, about 6 months later, on June 3rd, 1980, there was another false alarm. This one didn't involve a simulation. It involved the failure of what turned out to be a 46-cent computer chip inside a computer multiplexer at NORAD that malfunctioned, and when it malfunctioned, it started displaying random numbers and increasingly larger numbers of incoming Soviet ballistic missiles. First 2, and then 22, and then 222. And of course, this alarmed everybody too. They thought it was, they were pretty sure it was a false alarm, but they weren't positive. Again, the Airborne Command Post prepared to take off. Bombers were put on alert. It turned out again to be a false alarm. No problems. And they were able to find the problem and correct it in the computers. So that first incident that I told you about from October 1979 was not well publicized. In fact, it only became common knowledge in 1996 when it was included in former head of the CIA, Robert Gates's memoir, who Gates and Odom knew each other very well, and he repeated the story there. But the other incidents were widely reported at the time. And so when this film came out in June of 1983, so 41 years ago this June, I thought, and probably a lot of other people did too, that it must have been inspired by these incidents. But it turns out that's not the story at all. The story is actually quite interesting how this film came to be, because it evolved over several years. The film originally was not a high concept film at all. This is sort of the epitome of high concept. Child breaks into U.S. command post and almost starts World War III. Didn't start like that at all. The original concept was called The Genius, and it concerned a 13-year-old boy who comes to the attention of and eventually works with a Stephen Hawking-like scientist who is dying but seeking a way to pass along his life's work. And the screenwriters, Lawrence Lasker and Walter Parks, desperately wanted the scientist to be played by John Lennon. They just thought that would be really cool. And they actually had some conversations with Lennon about this. He was apparently receptive. Unfortunately, of course, he was assassinated in 1980, and so that never came to pass. That scientist ultimately became Stephen Falcon in the movie. But at that point, the film had nothing to do with computers or nuclear war at all. But the screenwriters faced a problem. They had to find a way for that child, that precocious kid, to come to the attention of the famous scientist. And so they started talking to people about what could be a precursor, what would be so dramatic that would cause somebody to take notice of something, of a person like this. They talked with futurist Peter Schwartz, no relation to me, in 1979, and he suggested exploring a link between video games and home computers, which are starting to become popular at the time, and NORAD, because the various displays there looked a lot like computer or arcade video games. Around that time, they also read Ron Mosenbaum's article in Harper's magazine called The Subterranean World of the Bomb, which talked about simulated nuclear launches, and they incorporated information about that into their draft. They also met with an engineer at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica named Willis Ware, who had been warning about computer security problems for more than a decade, and had even designed some of the software that was used at NORAD. And he is the person who told them that it was possible to access NORAD's computers from an outside phone line, because some of the officers who worked there preferred to work at home on the weekends, and they kept the line open to dial in themselves, believe it or not. Next, they arranged to tour NORAD themselves, which you can actually do. And after the tour, the then commander of NORAD, General James Hardinger, found them and said he would like to talk to them. He understood that they were making a movie. He said, "You're making a movie about me?" And he invited them to have a drink, and there's a cute story and then on the DVD about, well, gee, General, we've got to get back on our bus and get back. He said, I've got 5,000 people under my command. I can get you back to your hotel. Don't worry about it. So they had a drink. They talked, I suppose, in his office or a conference room about their idea. And he told them that he was very comfortable having human beings in control of all of these weapons. And that person, General Hardinger, became Barry Corbin's General Behringer in the film. The automated computer at the center of the story also evolved over time. Originally, it was a system called OLI, or OLI, which was a space-based defensive laser powered by artificial intelligence that goes awry. The WOPR acronym was coined by director John Badham, who thought that the actual name of the U.S. nuclear war plan, which used to be called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, was, quote, the most boring acronym he'd ever heard of. So he came up with WOPR on his own because he thought it sounded funny, wop, 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 and it also played off of Burger King's The Whopper. So that was one of his big contributions to the film, apart from directing it brilliantly. And even though Whopper/Joshua was a computer and an inanimate object, it essentially became a third character in the film. And a fun fact about the Whopper, by the way, it was entirely controlled by an Apple II computer, and those of you who know computers know what that means, operated by a special effects technician who sat inside of it and took directions from the director and other people, like, okay, make these lights blink, make this do this, make this do that. So very practical effects, not all the digital mumbo jumbo that we have today. So they're working on this screenplay. It's now evolved to the point that it's beginning, it's dealing with nuclear weapons, it's dealing with computers, it's getting interesting. In early 1979, Lawrence Lasker is watching the news, watching Walter Cronkite, CBS Evening News, and it reports a serious false alarm at NORAD, just like in the movie. He calls up Parks and says, "We're onto something here, keep writing." So they finish the script. The producers start shopping it around to all the studios. They think they've got something really special. Unfortunately, nobody else did. They just didn't understand it. Was it a kid's film? Was it a caper? Was it a comedy? I mean, what was it? They didn't get it. Eventually, however, United Artists said it was interested and wanted to make the film, and they brought on director Martin Brest, who was very highly regarded at the time. But his vision of the film was very different than Lasker and Parks. He had a somewhat darker vision about it. My understanding is that one of the drafts that he commissioned involved an actual sequence of World War III. It might have been a dream sequence, or maybe more appropriately a nightmare sequence, but it was a much, much, much darker film. Eventually, he had a falling out after a couple of weeks of filming with the studio, and also he didn't like what the screenwriters were doing, so after they turned in a second revised draft, they were essentially fired, and of course they'd shepherded this thing for several years. They were quite upset. But when the studio looked at Brest's early footage, they didn't like it. It wasn't the film that they thought that they had bought. They fired him and had him replaced with John Badham, who had just directed Saturday Night Live, so he was quite the hot commodity. And at this point, Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy are convinced that they're going to be fired too. So they're extremely nervous. And John Badham assures them, "No, don't worry, it's going to be fine." But he couldn't get them to relax on set. The very first scene he filmed with them is the one in David's bedroom. I'm not sure which part of it, whether they first log onto the computer and he's introducing her to all the computer lingo, or whether they're actually playing with Joshua at NORAD. But in any case, that's what he did, and it took like 30 or something takes to get them to relax and get them to realize that this was going to be a different film than what they were originally told, what they were practicing for. So he made it lighter. I mean, it's still a deep film, but he made it lighter, and he thought that was just the way to go. A couple of things. The NORAD Crystal Palace set was enormous. It cost $1 million, which was the most money ever spent on a set up to that point in time. Fun fact, the soundstage where that was built also was Munchkinland in The Wizard of Oz in 1939. So it was a massive, massive set. All of the images displayed on those screens, there's 12 large screens and 84 individual computer monitors, were played live during filming. They weren't added digitally after the fact. So everybody is reacting to this stuff in real time. Nobody had ever attempted this before. It was a very complicated combination of front and rear projection, and everything, including those very bright strobe lights simulating a nuclear detonation, all had to be perfectly synchronized, again by an Apple II computer. The film was actually nominated for Best Cinematography in part, I think, because of those effects. By the way, the real NORAD war room is considerably smaller and much less flashy than the one in the movie. In fact, when people who were familiar with or worked at NORAD saw the film, they were practically salivating. They didn't have all of those screens. They didn't have color monitors. They were operating with equipment that was designed and built in the 1960s, and I can show you some pictures in a few minutes about that. But it's a room not much larger than this room, okay, but significantly smaller than the one that we saw there. So although War Games did not originate as a story about nuclear war and human and machine fallibility, it arrived at just the right time, I would argue, to resonate with audiences worldwide. The Reagan administration embarked on a massive buildup of nuclear weapons and was talking about fighting and winning a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Arms control talks had broken off, tensions were rising, the Soviets had deployed new nuclear weapons in Europe, and the United States and NATO responded by building, and just in 1983, just starting to deploy weapons to counter those weapons. Each side's weapons were within a few minutes of the other, so there would have been exceedingly little warning time if anything had gone off. And in March 1983, 3 months before the film premiered, President Reagan announced his Strategic Defense Initiative, an attempt to both end the nuclear arms race and undercut the increasingly popular nuclear freeze movement at the time by proposing a technological solution to what was and is a political problem. So eventually the film gets made. The studio is still a little unsure about it, so they have some preview screenings. The first one they do is in San Antonio, Texas. and the audience applauds wildly at the scene at the end of the film when Joshua finally learns his lesson and says, "A strange game, the only winning move is not to play." And at that point, the creative team, who was of course there in the theater, had a very good feeling about how the film would be received when it opened on June the 3rd. So War Games cost about $12 million to make and made almost $80 million worldwide at the box office, becoming the 5th highest grossing film of 1983. It was nominated for 3 Academy Awards. So in addition to Best Cinematography, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Sound, it didn't win, unfortunately, any of those awards. The next interesting story is the day after it opened, Lawrence Lasker arranged for President Reagan to screen a print of it at Camp David because Lasker's parents were friends of the Reagans, and they all lived in Pacific Palisades, California. So Reagan did, and he was so impressed that at a meeting at the White House 2 days later with several congressional Democrats that was ostensibly to talk about nuclear arms control, Reagan set aside his note cards and asked his guests if they had seen the film. And then he began regaling with the plot, so much so that they had to ask him not to spoil the movie for them. Reagan then turned to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Vesey, and asked, could something like this really happen? And as you may know, those of you that have been around long enough, Reagan was not only of movies, he was very enamored by movies, and he sometimes had difficulty distinguishing between movies and reality. But when he saw something on the screen, this particularly resonated him, and he became worried about this. Could something like this really happen? Vesey said he would look into it, and a week later he returned with a report telling the president that it wasn't just a Hollywood fantasy. Quote, "The problem is much worse than you think." Reagan's question, prompted by a popular film, led to multiple interagency memos and meetings, and 15 months later culminated in a classified report and a new presidential directive to address the glaring gaps in cybersecurity and hopefully forestall the prospect of actual cyber warfare. So in an interesting and unintended consequence of what was just supposed to be some popular entertainment.